October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and domestic violence is an epidemic that impacts all people, no matter the race, class, gender, or culture. Domestic violence is pervasive. It impacts not just its victims, but also the cultures and communities around it. So here's the trigger warning. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today may be a trigger for some people who have experienced domestic violence in any capacity. If today's stories become too much for you to handle, turn this off, seek respite and self-care. So I want to frame the conversation around a broader idea, theology of shame. Shame has lots of biblical references. You hear this quote from the Bible about, "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." And in my context, I love the 1970s classic disco song Shame by Evelyn Champagne King. But shame is something that is indoctrinated into the fabric of our cultural, social, religious, and even political psyche. So shame, it's this feeling that we have. It's our very being and existence is wrong, is defective, is inadequate. It's a feeling that's internalized, it lives within us, and more often than not, it's something that's imposed on us by other people. Shame thrives in the darkness. It takes root in silence. Shame is so pervasive because restitution only comes when the truth of our stories make their way to the marvelous light. The theology of shame, it creates a politic of shame in which polices bodies and polices voices. The theology of shame is fueled by and upheld by the idea that people's shame will keep them in their place. People in power often oppose policies and theologies that can liberate people who are facing shameful experiences like domestic violence, because shame leaves us to wrestle with who we've been made to believe we are versus who God says we are. Shame upholds systematic patterns through poor interpretations of Scripture. The unwillingness to reconcile scriptures that promote and advocate for domestic violence, like Hagar's return to an abusive mistress in Genesis 16, or the Ephesians 5 text that calls for wives to submit to their husbands. These texts not only leave little room for varied partnership between people in same-sex relationships, but also, when wrongly interpreted, they perpetuate theologies that are harmful. So how are we, our churches, our faith leaders, our politicians who wrongly use faith as a farce for trash policy, how are we complicit by simply not reading Scripture for context and liberative discourse? When I was 22 years old, I was in an abusive relationship. I was a recent college graduate, and I had high hopes for what my future would hold. But I would put those dreams on hold to start a relationship with a man with whom I was having a baby. Not even a few months into the relationship, he became controlling. He was refusing to let me leave our home, punching holes in the walls. And one night, in the middle of the night, he would chase me out of our house, wielding a knife. I was afraid, but even more than that, I was ashamed that my life had taken such a turn. I was afraid to tell my family and friends about what it would mean to be this college graduate with so much promise, now in this abusive relationship, the shame of graduating from such a great college and no longer on the pursuit of my dreams, the shame of being in church all of my life and being told that not only was being a single mom something I should be ashamed of, but the sex that I had to become a single mom was something to be ashamed of. The shame of believing that if the world around me and the faith within me said who I was and who I was becoming, this was just my lot in life. But this is why dismantling the theology of shame is essential when talking about issues like domestic violence. How do we reconcile a faith whose scripture promotes violence? What do we do with a text that frames the thinking and policy making of people in power who are ashamed of their own wrongs? And because they don't want to deal with their own mess, they make others wrestle alone in silence. There's an exchange of power, a reclaiming of power for accountability's sake that telling our stories allow us to do. Domestic violence and shame are inextricably linked to uphold the structures that seek to silence people. We have the charge to tell the truth. We have to testify for the sake of liberation and accountability. We who seek freedom from oppression, from violence, from marginalization must not rest, must not be silent, must not shrink away from the power of testimony. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence of any kind, call the domestic violence hotline at 1-800-799-7233.